Hey everyone, my name is Corel, and tonight we're going to be going over another From the Depths tutorial. This time we're going to be going over a few different APS cannon designs, and we're going to be doing something a little different. You might notice this platform is not full, and though we're definitely not covering every archetype of cannon, but I figured what I'd do here is show you a few things that work, and then give you some general ideas as to some interesting shell designs that aren't commonly seen. Basic damage shell is not hard to design in From the Depths, but some of this other stuff that we've got going on here is not exactly common knowledge, so I figure I'll go through this, show you some of the unusual scenarios you can get yourself into, and then you can see what you want to do for yourself from there. As with the missile demos, I will post this vehicle, this platform here, in the From the Depths forums and include a link in the video description. If you're interested in seeing this for yourself, just go there and check it out. Starting off over here, we have a flak cannon. This is a very small flak cannon, as you might notice, but very large gauge. That's one thing I've noticed about flak cannons in general. Having a small flak cannon is fairly effective, but the smaller your flak cannon is, the larger the gauge you want to go for. Basic reason for this is that at higher gauges, a short shell can deal a lot more damage. If I take a look at this ammo customizer, and I put this up to the point where I have exactly enough for a 1 meter shell rack. I believe that's 450 millimeters in shell diameter. You can see here I have 1864 flak damage. That's easily enough to shoot down most small, or all small really, and most medium missiles. So a lot of missiles are just going to get swatted out of the sky by one shell. And that's pretty ideal for this because with a smaller cannon we're not going to be able to maintain a high fire rate pretty much no matter what we do, unless we drop the gauge so drastically that we no longer have enough damage to kill missiles quickly. So the smaller our cannon is, the more useful I find having a large gauge shell is, specifically in the case of anti-missile cannons using flak. The next cannon over is a larger cannon that does still use flak shells and is used for anti-missile work, but it's got a much higher fire rate. In order to maintain that higher fire rate, it needs more components. So what I've got over here is really pretty adequate. So yeah, let's dig right on in and see what exactly is up with this cannon. First off, we've got a shell. This has a timed fuse and a flak warhead and a flak head. Flak head is there for aerodynamics, flak warhead's there for damage, and we have a timed fuse just to make sure that the shell goes off at the appropriate time. So over here, we have the AI set up for this. I've got both an AI anti-missile cannon controller and a local weapon controller. The anti-missile cannon controller down here, if you note in the UI, the priority of this is set to 10. That means that with a priority over here on this local weapon controller of 0, the anti-missile cannon controller will take priority over the regular local weapon controller whenever there is a missile in the air. Now, you might not want the local weapon controller at all for a pure anti-missile system, because it can mean that there's some gaps in your coverage here and there, especially with this small of a cannon. Effectively, I'm firing 4 shells at a fairly good rate, and then I have a short gap between shells. So the anti-missile cannon, or the local weapon controller here rather, might fire those 4 shells at a target, then the target gets within range and launches missiles, at which point I have a small gap in my coverage, and those missiles might be able to get to us before the anti-missile cannon controller can take over and fire more shells. So you want to be a little bit careful about this, but overall I think I've optimized this particular cannon well enough that it's not going to have too many gaps in coverage. So what I've got here, this is a 450 millimeter cannon, as I've noticed, or noted. There are railgun chargers here and there, just 3 of them. Those are actually super important. If you note in our shell design, there are no casings. There are no railgun casings, there are no gunpowder casings. That leads to a very short shell, and I'm just using railguns to fire the shell. More specifically, over here in this railgun tab, you can see I'm still limiting this to 1,000 energy a shot. If I come back over to my shell and put in 1,000 rail draw, you can see I'm getting 247 meters a second out of the muzzle velocity of this thing. That's actually perfectly reasonable for a flak shell that's not meant to catch up to fast-moving aircraft. while this can function as an anti-aircraft gun with a local weapon controller there, really what we're doing here is setting up a shell that's meant to go after missiles primarily and can contribute a little bit of DPS on the side if it gets the chance. So I don't really care about the shell speed so much as long as it's sufficient for intercepting missiles. And 250 meters per second is plenty fast for that. I technically would not even need the second railgun magnet and magnet attaching fixture because I only need a capacity of 1,000, and each one of these railgun magnets gives me 5,000. So one optimization I can make here is to actually strip these off and put one underneath instead with a single railgun barrel magnet, and that is perfectly sufficient. So another thing we can note here, we have a capacity of 600 recharge per second. That is technically actually more than we need. Another thing of note is that railgun chargers here are 400 materials each. That's very expensive, and really, if we look at the rail use here, we are at 134 energy per second used. I can knock 2 of these railgun chargers off because they're 200 each, and run with a single railgun charger, and that is enough for this cannon. Saving money on this cannon is a very good thing because we're using 4 belt-fed autoloaders, and those are 500 materials apiece, so we're already investing 2,000 materials just in the autoloaders. That's kind of painful. Let's go ahead and load in some targets, and I'll show you how well it works. Alright, so as you can see here, we've got our drones loaded in. And I've turned God mode on for all of these vehicles just so that they don't completely obliterate us and we don't completely obliterate them, because these things are really only capable of handling one hit. As you can see there, we got about 4 shots off, then missiles started to slip through. It's the downside of firing such a small cannon as an offensive weapon. However, if you will note here, I'm going to turn God mode off on these now, and you'll see that very quickly this becomes a non-issue because those vehicles are going to get swatted out of the sky. Missiles, too. They didn't stand much of a chance. Neither did that particular drone. Or that one. Yeah. These flak cannons don't deal a great deal of damage to armor, but if there's exposed components like those tiny little missile drones, it's enough. Next up is this more mid-sized cannon. This is, again, a flak cannon used for anti-missile work, but it is also perfectly capable of hitting aircraft and other light vehicles as well. This shell is designed for a 71mm gun. We fit exactly into a 1-meter shell rack, so again we can use the belt-fed autoloaders. We've got 8 of them here, and at 500 materials apiece, that is 4,000 materials. Not cheap, but I think it's pretty well worth it in this case because this cannon, unlike the previous one, does not suffer the same gaps in coverage, and it can fire for much, much longer before running out of ammo. Let's go ahead and give it a shot, and we'll see what it's capable of. Alright, so I've spawned in a Stinger Mark III, and you can see here, this thing has a lot of different missiles. This is a white flare vehicle. It's kind of a cross between a bomber and a jet, with long-range missiles, so we can see it flying around here, and it's going to get pretty well pestered by this cannon. Some of the shells are even hitting it, which ain't bad. This is not a railgun of any type, so we are simply relying on the cannon's gunpowder in order to get the shells out. That means we do have to worry about barrel cooldown. One thing I haven't really talked about much is that barrel cooldown does not play any role whatsoever unless you're using gunpowder. So if we have a gunpowderless shell over here that is a pure railgun, we don't have any barrel cooldown. That can be quite useful, especially when we're talking about upping our fire rate or multi-barrel cannons if we want to use some sort of a shotgun effect. So yeah, that's fairly effective. That pulled that little jet out of the sky pretty easily. What happens if we actually just give it a bunch of missiles to shoot at? I mean quite a lot of missiles. Alright, so you can see this cannon's firing away, and we've got 4 of these drones out here. And these are just firing little missiles without any payloads on them. But you can see this thing is doing a fantastic job at taking these out, and it's even getting some shots in at the launching vehicles, despite there being 4 of these drones. An occasional missile will still slip through, but by and large, this is very effective at bringing all of them down before they hit. And it has, as you can see, a much, much longer ability to keep firing before it has to go into a reload cycle. So yeah, this is a much more effective flak cannon, but it is a 5x5 diameter instead of a 3x3. The one on the left can fit into a 3x3 column. This one takes the full 5x5. All of these cannons on this vehicle, with the exception of this stupid one over here, are designed to fit into some sort of column so they can be mounted mostly below decks on a battleship. If I was to turn God mode off on all of these missile drones, you'll see pretty quickly that whenever this thing gets a free chance to shoot, it starts shredding these vehicles, and it's going to start picking them off very quickly once it has no more missiles to deal with from each of them. Alright, for our next test, I've enlisted the help of this armor test block. This is a little test dummy that I made. It's got a bunch of engine blocks in the back to represent fragile components inside of a vehicle. It's got a bunch of different armor classes, ranging from the lightest on the left to the heaviest on the right. And it's not exactly, perfect amounts of this or anything. This is kind of slapped together. But we've also got glass around the border here just so that we can look inside and see what's going on. All right, so let's go ahead and start taking a look at the next cannon with the help of that. Now, you might have noticed when you initially started looking at this platform that there's something that's not like the others. One of these things is not quite the same. In fact, that one is next on our list. Let's go ahead and start taking a look at the Mega Cannon. This is a particularly gnarly style of cannon because, well, you'll notice there are no autoloaders. There are no clips. There are no autoloaders or clips in the game that are sufficient to fit this particular design of shell. It's too big. This thing is a monstrosity and should not exist. Seriously, don't use this. It's dumb. It's here to prove a point more than anything. You can direct feed shells much larger than you can fit into any length of autoloader by placing your ammo intakes directly on the firing piece. This, in fact, is the maximum length of shell that you can add. And at 500 millimeters, you can see from the damage stats over here, this does some obscene amount of damage. It's silly. It's really dumb. Don't ever do this. But if you wanted to do this, here's what it does. I didn't even bother attaching an AI to this thing because it is so stupid. It fires like once every 6 minutes. AI would never make anything of this. But just for funsies, let's go ahead and shoot it. It makes a pretty good hole in things. Yeah. Next up on our list is a pure railgun. I've noticed lately in the meta since the APS rework that railguns are getting a lot more attention, as well they should. Railguns are they've got a lot of things going for them now. You can get an increased accuracy from adding even a tiny bit of rail charge to your gun. It's just a really great way to make sure that you get some pretty accurate, pretty lethal firepower. So I've been experimenting a lot more with these, and that's kind of where some of these quirky designs came from. In this particular case, we're using 3 solid bodies and a hollow point warhead. So that will give us, with our shell parameters here, we are at 500 millimeters, and we are using approximately 35,000 railgun charge. So at 500 millimeters, and with 35,000 railgun charge, we have an expected thump damage of nearly 25,000, with a thump armor pierce of 24.1. That's pretty good. That will deal rather a lot of damage. Now we are using 3200 power per second, so this is a cannon that has a fairly high power draw. Do need to be careful of that. Also, it doesn't have anything like enough recoil absorption on it, but that is to a large degree countered by the fact that I'm using some of the railgun for accuracy. Therefore, this cannon is not quite living up to the 35,000 power draw that this shell would indicate, but it's still pretty good. Now what I'm going to do here, I'm going to set the wireless receiver to channel 1, then I'm going to fly over to this armor test dummy, where I have an enemy simulator. We're going to activate this for 10 seconds and just see what it does. Yeah, one shot pretty well blew a chunk through most of that fairly heavy armor. I've got metal, 2 layers of stone, and a layer of applique back here, and it pretty well just shot clean through it. In fact, if I disable these repair tentacles here by deleting them, we can manually fire this ourselves and get a better idea of what it does against the various different armor types. If I was to fire a shot against light armor, you can see it pretty well shreds the light armor, and in fact shreds a very large gap in it, leaving us with a nice large hole that we can then fire through. I'm going to disable my own repair tentacles here as well. And now let's try 2 layers of stacked metal armor. That resisted much better, but we still have a hole straight through to the juicy inner bits. We are using a hollow point shell, so that's going to stop as soon as we hit armor and immediately discharge all of its kinetic energy into the armor. So this needs to be followed up by some other type of shell or some other type of weapon in order to deal damage to the inner components. However, what this is doing is shredding through armor with ease. It's taking out huge chunks of even fairly durable armor here. This is stacked light armor, stone, and metal. It just walked through it. And if I'd shot that more squarely, it would have done even more damage, probably. That one didn't quite get through because it spread the damage out so much, but it still just really shredded that armor up. So a few shells from a cannon like this will do a real number on any opponent in no time. Again, we didn't quite get through the heavier armor. And the heaviest design here, once we get another shot ready, we don't even get through the applique layer that is the third to last layer. So yeah, while effective, it's not going to counter armor completely by itself. So this cannon is here mostly just to give you an idea of what's possible with a pure railgun, and I'd say they're really quite effective. We have at 500 millimeters and 35,000 rail draw. We have a really fast shell here, so overall this is a very nice cannon, especially for shooting down air targets. A nimble air target is going to be fairly hard to hit most of the time, but you can hit them fairly reliably if you have a fairly fast shell. Another thing of note here, especially with these railguns, one thing you always want to do is hit Q on the gun and drag the required accuracy before firing all the way down. 2 degrees is a fair amount of inaccuracy. If you drag this down to 0.1, the gun will always wait until it has a good firing solution before it opens fire. This is what you want most of the time, especially when you're talking about cannons that don't fire very frequently and are relying on pure target prediction in order to actually hit the target. If you have something with fins on it that can make adjustments midway, that's one thing. But firing a cannon, you can't do that. So you want to make sure that you are as accurate as possible at the point of firing, especially if you're firing a cannon that's not going to have a high rate of fire. Next up, we have a kind of battleship cannon. This thing is very poorly optimized. You can tell there's cannon parts hanging off all over the place. This thing is hideously expensive due to the number of railgun chargers. Just overall not a very well optimized cannon, but it's here mostly just to show you what you can do when trying to Tetris multiple guns into the same form factor. Might give you a few ideas, might not, but it's here just mostly as an example. I would definitely not recommend using this cannon directly on your own battleship. But let's go ahead and take a look at what we've got here. First off, we have 3 different 500mm cannons on a single turret. And down here, we've got our shell. And let's go ahead and take a look at the rail draw on the cannon so we know what to set that to. We are drawing a maximum of 20,000 or 200,000 power, of which the shell can only use 40,000. So let's go ahead and set this to 40,000. And now we can see more or less the exact stats of the shell. So not very much explosive damage, not very much explosive radius. We have a hollow point head that's going to guarantee explosion on the first point of impact. We've got a solid warhead body. Then we've got a shaped charge, secondary, and an HE warhead body, which are going to kind of shove some particles into the target vehicle, hopefully. So let's get this set up and take it a few test fires. Alright, so I've taken control of this cannon here. Let's go ahead and start off with firing at this leftmost target, shall we? Yeah, so that's going to leave a little bit of a dent. And we kind of punched through and started dealing damage to some internal components as well. That's hitting the thin armor. Let's just go ahead and keep going through our armor list here. You'll note that these cannons are, again, not very fast firing. That is kind of by design, or by design of From the Depths, I should say. That's one thing we've all had to adjust to from the recent patches, but more or less the fast-firing Doom cannons of before are gone, and now you're going to have to deal with a, honestly, more realistic rate of fire for such a large cannon. Moving on to our heavier armor sets, we can see that these are not even working their way all the way through the armor, but they're still doing quite a bit of damage, and, you know, these are pretty respectable cannons. They've got a high shell speed, they're not going to miss many targets, they're going to be pretty effective overall. But at the same time, still not punching all the way through the armor. With the APS rework, a really good armor layout is really hard to destroy, to be honest. And that's probably a good thing for the health of the game because it encourages vehicle fights where really armor matters. It means that you can actually defend yourself properly, especially if you start getting into shielding on top of your armor. The last gun I'm going to show you here is on display one that I'm kind of proud of. This is what I would like to call a disabler round. We've got a disruptor conduit here, we've got an EMP warhead, we've got an inertial fuse, and a smoke warhead, all powered by a single gunpowder casing. This is fired by a cannon that has just 2 railgun chargers on it, and this is a pretty well optimized cannon as far as what's available on it, with the exception that it does not even attempt to use all of its capacity here. So yeah, we're not even attempting to max out the amount of railgun charge that we can use every shot. Rather, we have the allow railgun to fire when partially charged turned on, and we're just using that for an accuracy buff in order to make sure that we keep firing fairly accurately at the target. So what exactly is this shell intended to do? Well, we've got a disruptor conduit. This is intended to break shields, obviously. We have a little bit of EMP damage here with 1,368 damage. It's probably enough to break a shield block. We've also got shield strength being reduced to 31.6% of its current value. We've also got a smoke strength of 912, which means that laser AP is reduced to about 31% of its original value. That's kind of nuts. That means that enemy lasers are going to be completely neutered when passing through this thing, and we've also disrupted and destroyed their shields. That coming from a cannon that is not very large and not very expensive is very powerful. Therefore, even though this particular gun is not designed to actually deal damage to the target, it won't break armor, it won't actually break blocks of any sort really when it hits them, other than potentially shield blocks. This cannon is still remarkably effective at accomplishing its goal of disabling target vehicles without actually destroying them. You're still going to need to rely on missiles or other cannons to do the destroying, but this thing can go a long ways towards making that easier. So as far as the actual firing of this cannon, it's really pretty straightforward. You shoot it, and you get a bunch of smoke. That's really all that you're going to see. The EMP will be channeled through to shields, but yeah, that's some extremely dense smoke, and we can coat an entire vehicle with this because the fire rate on this cannon is actually pretty good. So, not a damage cannon, still very effective at what it does. That's really all the cannon types that I have to show you here. These are kind of specialty cannons for the most part. Building a basic damage dealing cannon in From the Depths is not necessarily difficult, and there are a lot of tutorials that cover that sort of thing. So I'm not really going over, the overall how do I build a cannon that deals damage. I'm more going over a few different types of specialty cannons that I really found useful and that I've had a lot of fun developing. So that's all for today, and I hope I'll see you next time where we will start going over the basics of lasers.